Oh, okay. So we gotta read pages 42 to 59, but I got a bit of homework, so I'm gonna split it in half, and I'm gonna do the first half right now, and then the second half tomorrow, just because. Yeah. So I'm gonna read 42 to like 50, and I'll stop at about. This is about halfway. Okay. I don't have a water bottle. Oh no. Okay, I do have one. Okay. Although colonists, both North and South, were bound together by a common language and a common allegiance to Mother England, they established different patterns of settlement, different economies, different political systems, and even different sets of values, defining distinctive regional characteristics that would persist for generations. The promise of riches, especially from golden-leaf tobacco, drew the first settlers to the southern colonies. But to the north, in the fertile valleys of the middle Atlantic region, and especially along the rocky shores of New England, it was not worldly health, but religious devotion that principally shaped the earliest settlements. The Protestant Reformation produces Puritanism. Little did the German friar Martin Luther suspect when he nailed his protests against the Catholic doctrines to the door of Wittenberg's cathedral in 1517 that he was shaping the destiny of a yet unknown nation. Denouncing the authority of priests and popes, Luther declared that the Bible alone was the source of God's word. He ignited a fire of religious reform, the Protestant Reformation, that licked its way across Europe for more than a century, dividing peoples, toppling sovereigns, and kindling the spiritual fervor of millions of men and women, some of whom helped to found America. The reforming flame burned especially brightly in the bosom of John Calvin of Geneva. This somber and severe religious leader elaborated Martin Luther's ideas in a way that profoundly affected the thought and character of generations of Americans yet unborn. Calvinism became the dominant theological credo not only of New England Puritans, but of other American settlers as well, including the Scottish Presbyterians, French Huguenots, and communicants of the Dutch Reformed Church. Calvin spelled out his basic doctrine in a learned Latin tome of 1536 entitled Institutes of the Christian Religion. God, Calvin argued, was all-powerful and all-good. Humans, because of the corrupting effect of original sin, were weak and wicked. God was also all-knowing, and he knew who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. Since the first moment of creation, some souls, the elect, had been destined for eternal bliss, and others for eternal torment. Good works could not save those whom predestination had marked for the infernal fires. But neither could the elect count on their predetermined salvation and lead lives of wild, immoral abandon. For one thing, no one could be certain of his or her status in the heavenly ledger. Gnawing doubts about their eternal fate plagued Calvinists. They constantly sought, in themselves and others, signs of conversion, or the receipt of God's free gift of saving grace. Conversion was thought to be an intense, identifiable personal experience in which God revealed to the elect their heavenly destiny. Thereafter, they were expected to lead sanctified lives, demonstrating by their holy behavior that they were among the visible saints. These doctrines swept into England just as King Henry VIII was breaking his ties with the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s, making himself the head of the Church of England. Henry would have been content to retain Roman rituals and creeds, but his action powerfully stimulated some English religious reformers to undertake a total purification of the English Christianity. Many of these Puritans, as it happened, came from the commercially depressed woolen districts. Calvinism, with its message of stark but reassuring order in the divine plan, fed on this social unrest and provided spiritual comfort to the economically disadvantaged. As time went on, Puritans grew increasingly unhappy over the snail-like progress of the Protestant Reformation in England. They burned with pious zeal to see the Church of England wholly decatholicized. The most devout Puritans, including those who eventually settled New England, believed that only visible saints, that is, persons who felt the stirrings of grace in their souls and could demonstrate its presence to their fellow Puritans, should be admitted to church membership. But the Church of England enrolled all the king's subjects, which meant that the saints had to share pews and communion rails with the damned. Appalled by this unholy fraternizing, a tiny group of dedicated Puritans, known as Separatists, vowed to break away entirely from the Church of England. King James I, a shrewd Scotsman, was head of both the state and the church in England from 1603 to 1625. He quickly perceived that if his subjects could defy him as their spiritual leader, they might one day defy him as their political leader, as in fact they would later defy and behead his son, Charles I. He therefore threatened to harass the more bothersome separatists out of the land. The Pilgrims and their pilgrimage at Plymouth. The most famous congregations of separatists, fleeing royal wrath, departed for Holland in 1608. During the ensuing 12 years of toil and poverty, they were increasingly distressed by the Dutchification of their children. They longed to find a haven where they could live and die as English men and women, and as purified Protestants. America was the logical refuge, despite the early ordeals of Jamestown and despite tales of New World cannibals roasting steaks from their white victims over open fires. A group of the separatists in Holland, after negotiating with the Virginia Company, at length secured rights to settle under its jurisdiction. But their crowded Mayflower, 65 days at sea, missed its destination and arrived off the stony coast of New England in 1620 with a total of 102 persons. One had died en route, and an unusually short casualty list, and one had been born and appropriately named Oceanus. Fewer than half of the entire party were separatists. Prominent among the non-belongers was a peppery and stocky soldier of fortune, Captain Miles Standish, dubbed by one of his critics as Captain Shrimp. He later rendered indispensable service as an Indian fighter and negotiator. The Pilgrims did not make their initial landing at Plymouth Rock, as commonly supposed, but undertook a number of preliminary surveys. They finally chose for their site the shore of the inhospitable Plymouth Bay. This area was outside the domain of the Virginia Company, and consequently the settlers became squatters. They were without legal right to land, and without specific authority to establish a government. Before disembarking, the Pilgrim leaders drew up and signed the brief Mayflower Compact. Although setting an invaluable precedent for later written constitutions, this document was not a constitution at all. It was a simple agreement to reform a crude government and to submit to the will of the majority under the regulations agreed upon. The compact was signed by 41 adult males, 11 of them with the exalted rank of Mr., though not by the servants and 2 seamen. The pact was a promising step towards genuine self-government, for soon the adult male settlers were assembling to make their own laws in open discussion town meetings, a vital laboratory of liberty. The Pilgrims' first winter of 1620 to 1621 took a grisly toll. Only 44 out of the 102 survived. At one time, only 7 were well enough to lay the dead in their frosty graves. Yet when the Mayflower sailed back to England in the spring, not a single one of the courageous band of separatists left. As one of them wrote, "It is not with us as with other men, whom small things can discourage." God made his children prosperous, so the Pilgrims believed. The next autumn, that of 1621, brought a bountiful harvest, and with them the first Thanksgiving Day in New England. In time, the frail colony found sound economic legs in fur, fish, and lumber. The beaver and the Bible were the early mainstays, the one for the sustenance of the body, the other for the sustenance of the soul. Plymouth proved that the English could maintain themselves in this uninviting region. The Pilgrims were extremely fortunate in their leaders. Prominent among them was the cultured William Bradford, a self-taught scholar who read Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French, and Dutch. He was a chosen governor 30 times in the annual elections. Among his major worries was his fear that the independent, non-Puritan settlers on their particular might corrupt his godly experiment in the wilderness. Bustling fishing villages and other settlements did sprout to the north of Plymouth, on the storm-lashed shores of Massachusetts Bay, where many people were as much as interested in cod as God. God, I can't believe this. This book rhymes so much. Quiet and quaint, the little colony of Plymouth was never important economically or numerically. Its population numbered only 7,000 in 1691 when, still charterless, it merged with its giant neighbor, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But the tiny settlement of Pilgrims was big both morally and spiritually. The Bay Colony Bible Commonwealth. The separatist Pilgrims were dedicated extremists, the purist Puritans. More moderate Puritans sought to reform the Church of England from within. Though resented by bishops and monarchs, they slowly gathered support, especially in Parliament. But when Charles I dismissed Parliament in 1629 and sanctioned the anti-Puritan persecutions of the reactionary Archbishop William Laud, many Puritans saw catastrophe in the making. In 1629, an energetic group of non-separatist Puritans, fearing for their faith and for England's future, secured a royal charter to form the Massachusetts Bay Company. They proposed to establish a sizable settlement in the infertile Massachusetts area, with the Boston soon becoming its hub. Stealing a march on both king and church, the newcomers brought their charter with them. For many years, they used it as a kind of constitution, out of easy reach of royal authority. They steadfastly denied that they wanted to separate from the Church of England, only from its impurities. But back in England, the highly orthodox Archbishop Laud noticed that the Bay Colony Puritans were swine which rooted in God's vineyard. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was singularly blessed. The well-equipped expedition of 1630, with 11 vessels carrying nearly 1,000 immigrants, started the colony off on a larger scale than any of the other English settlements. Continuing turmoil in England tossed up an additional enriching waves of Puritans on the shores of Massachusetts in the following decade. During the Great English Migration of the 1630s, about 70,000 refugees left England, but not all of them were Puritans, and only about 20,000 came to Massachusetts. Many were attracted to the warm and fertile West Indies, especially the sugar-rich islands of Barbados. More Puritans came to this Caribbean islet than to all of Massachusetts. Many fairly prosperous, educated persons immigrated to the Bay Colony, including John Winthrop, a well-to-do pillar of English society, who became the colony's first governor. A successful attorney and a manor lord in England, Winthrop eagerly accepted the offer to become governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, believing that he had a calling from God to lead the new religious experiment. He served as governor, or deputy governor, for 19 years. The resources and skills of talented settlers like Winthrop helped Massachusetts prosper, as fur trading, fishing, and shipbuilding blossomed into important industries, especially fish and ships. The Massachusetts Bay Colony rapidly shot to the fore as both the biggest and the most influential of the New England outposts. Massachusetts also benefited from a shared sense of the purpose among most of the first settlers. "We shall be as a city upon a hill, a beacon to humanity," declared Governor Winthrop. The Puritan Bay colonists believed that they had a covenant with God, an agreement to build a holy society that would be a model for humankind. Building the Bay Colony. These common convictions deeply shaped the infant colony's life. Soon after the colonists' arrival, the franchise was extended to all free men, adult males who belonged to the Puritan congregations, which in time came to be called collectively the Congregational Church. Unchurched men remained voteless in provincial elections, as did all women. On this basis, about 2/5 of adult males enjoyed the franchise in provincial affairs, a far larger proportion than in contemporary England. Town governments, which conducted much important business, were even more inclusive. There, all male property holders, and in some cases other residents as well, enjoyed the priceless boon of publicly discussing local issues, often with much heat, and of voting on them by a majority rule show of hands. Yet the provincial government, liberal by the standards of the time, was not a democracy. The able Governor Winthrop feared and distrusted the commons as the meaner sort, and thought that the democracy was the meanest and worst of all forms of government. "If the people be governors," asked one Puritan clergyman, "who shall be governed?" True, the freemen annually elected the governor and his assistants, as well as a representative assembly called the General Court, but only Puritans, the visible saints, who alone were eligible for church membership, could be freemen. And according to the doctrine of the covenant, the whole purpose of government was to enforce God's laws, which applied to believers and non-believers alike. Moreover, non-believers as well as believers paid taxes for the government-supported church. Religious leaders thus wielded enormous influence in the Massachusetts Bible Commonwealth. They powerfully influenced admission to church membership by conducting public interrogations of persons claiming to have experienced conversion. Prominent among the early clergy was fiery John Cotton. Educated at England's Cambridge University, a Puritan citadel, he immigrated to Massachusetts to avoid persecution for his criticism of the Church of England. In the Bay Colony, he devoted his considerable learning to defending the government's duty to enforce religious rules. Profoundly pious, he sometimes preached and prayed up to 6 hours in a single day. But the power of the preachers was not absolute. A congregation had the right to hire and fire its minister and to set his salary. Clergymen were also barred from holding formal political office. Puritans in England had suffered too much at the hands of a political Anglican clergy to permit in the New World another unholy union of religious and government power. In a limited way, the Bay colonists thus endorsed the idea of separation of church and state. The Puritans were a worldly lot, despite, or even because of, their spiritual intensity. Like John Winthrop, they believed in the doctrine of a calling to do God's work on earth. They shared in what was later called the Protestant ethic, which involved serious commitment to work and to engagement in worldly pursuits. Legend to the contrary, they also enjoyed simple pleasures. They ate plentifully, drank heartily, sang songs occasionally, and made love mostly monogamously. Like other peoples of their time in both America and Europe, they passed laws aimed at making sure these pleasures stayed simple by repressing certain human instincts. In New Haven, for example, a young married couple was fined 20 shillings for the crime of kissing in public, and in later years Connecticut came to be dubbed the Blue Law State. It was so named for the blue paper on which the repressive laws, also known as sumptuary laws, were printed. Yet, to the Puritans, life was serious business, and hellfire was real. A hell where sinners shriveled and shrieked in vain for divine mercy. An immensely popular poem in New England, selling one copy for every 20 people, was clergyman Michael Wigglesworth's Day of Doom, 1622. Especially horrifying were his descriptions of the fate of the damned. They cry, they roar for anger sore, and gnaw their tongues for horror. But get away without delay, Christ pities not your cry. Depart to hell, there you may yell and roar eternally. Trouble in the Bible Commonwealth. The Bay Colony enjoyed a high degree of social harmony, stemming from common beliefs in its early years, but even in this tightly knit community, dissension soon appeared. Quakers, who flouted the authority of the Puritan clergy, were persecuted with fines, floggings, and banishment. In one extreme case, 4 Quakers who defied expulsion, one of them a woman, were hanged on the Boston Common. A sharp challenge to Puritan orthodoxy came from Anne Hutchinson. She was an exceptionally intelligent, strong-willed, and talkative woman, ultimately the mother of 14 children. Swift and sharp in theological argument, she carried to logical extremes the Puritan doctrine of predestination. She claimed that holy life was no sure sign of salvation, and that the truly saved need not bother to obey the law of either God or man. This assertion, known as antinomianism, from the Greek against the law, was high heresy. Brought to trial in 1638, the quick-witted Hutchinson bamboozled clerical inquisitors for days until she eventually boasted that she had come by her beliefs through a direct revelation from God. This was even higher heresy. The Puritan magistrates had little choice but to banish her, lest she pollute the entire Puritan experiment. With her family, she set out on foot for Rhode Island, though pregnant. She finally moved to New York, where she and all but one of her household were killed by Indians. Back in the Bay Colony, the pious John Winthrop saw God's hand in her fate. More threatening to Puritan leaders was a personable and popular Salem minister, Roger Williams. Williams was a young man with radical ideas and an unrestrained tongue. An extreme separatist, he hounded his fellow clergymen to make a clean break with the corrupt Church of England. He also challenged the legality of the Bay Colony's charter, which he condemned for expropriating the land from the Indians without fair compensation. As if all this were not enough, he went on to deny the authority of civil government to regulate religious behavior, a seditious blow at the Puritan idea of government's very purpose. Their patience exhausted by 1635, the Bay Colony authorities found Williams guilty of disseminating new and dangerous opinions and ordered him banished. He was permitted to remain several months longer because of illness, but he kept up his criticisms. The outraged magistrates, fearing that he might organize a rival colony of malcontents, made plans to exile him to England, but Williams foiled them. The Rhode Island Sewer. Aided by friendly Indians, Roger Williams fled to the Rhode Island area in 1636, in the midst of a bitter winter. At Providence, the courageous and far-visioned Williams built a Baptist church, probably the first in America. He established complete freedom of the religion, even for Jews and Catholics. He demanded no oaths regarding religious beliefs, no compulsory attendance at worship, no taxes to support a state church. He even sheltered the abused Quakers, although disagreeing sharply with their views. Williams' endorsement of religious tolerance made Rhode Island more liberal than any of the other English settlements in the New World, and more advanced than most Old World communities as well. Those outcasts who clustered about Roger Williams enjoyed additional blessings. They exercised simple manhood suffrage from the start, though this broad-minded practice was later narrowed by a property qualification. Opposed to special privilege of any of the sort, the intrepid Rhode Islanders managed to achieve remarkable freedom of opportunity. Other scattered settlements soon dotted Rhode Island. They consisted largely of malcontents and exiles, some of whom could not bear the stifling theological atmosphere of the Bay Colony. Many of these restless souls in Rogues Island, including Anne Hutchinson, had little in common with Roger Williams, except being unwelcome anywhere else. The Puritan clergy back in Boston sneered at Rhode Island as that sewer in which the Lord's debris had collected and rotted. Planted by dissenters and exiles, Rhode Island became strongly individualistic and stubbornly independent. With good reason, Little Rhodey was later known as the traditional home of the otherwise minded. Begun as a squatter colony in 1636 without legal standing, it finally established its right to the soil when it secured a charter from the Parliament in 1644. A huge bronze statue of the independent man appropriately stands today on the dome of the State House in Providence. New England spreads out. The Smiling Valley of the Connecticut River, one of the few highly fertile expanses of any size in all New England, had meanwhile attracted a sprinkling of the Dutch and English settlers. Hartford was founded in 1635. The next year witnessed a spectacular beginning of the centuries-long westward movement across the continent. An energetic group of Boston Puritans, led by the Reverend Thomas Hooker, swarmed as a body into the Hartford area, with the ailing Mrs. Hooker carried on a horse litter. 3 years later, in 1639, the settlers of the new Connecticut River Colony drafted in open meeting a trailblazing document known as the Fundamental Orders. It was, in effect, a modern constitution, which established a regime democratically controlled by the substantial citizens. Essential features of the Fundamental Orders were later borrowed by Connecticut for its colonial charter and ultimately for its state constitution. Another flourishing Connecticut settlement began to spring up at New Haven in 1638. It was a prosperous community, founded by Puritans who contrived to set up an even closer church-government alliance than in Massachusetts. Although only squatters without a charter, the colonists dreamed of making New Haven a bustling seaport, but they fell into disfavor with Charles II as a result of having sheltered 2 of the judges who had condemned his father, Charles I, to death. In 1662, to the acute distress of the New Havenites, the Crown granted a charter to Connecticut that merged New Haven with the more democratic settlements in the Connecticut Valley. Far to the north, enterprising fishermen and fur traders had been active on the coast of Maine for a dozen or so years before the founding of Plymouth. After disheartening attempts at colonization in 1623 by Sir Ferdinando Gorges, this land of lakes and forests was absorbed by Massachusetts Bay after a formal purchase in 1677 from the Gorges heirs. It remained a part of Massachusetts for nearly a century and a half before becoming a separate state. Granite-ribbed New Hampshire also sprang from the fishing and trading activities along its narrow coast. It was absorbed in 1641 by the grasping Bay Colony, under a strained interpretation of the Massachusetts Charter. The king, annoyed by this display of greed, arbitrarily separated New Hampshire from Massachusetts in 1679 and made it a royal colony. Puritans versus Indians. The spread of English settlements inevitably led to clashes with the Indians, who were particularly weak in New England. Shortly before the Pilgrims had arrived at Plymouth in 1620, an epidemic, probably triggered by contact with English fishermen, had swept through the coastal tribes and killed more than 3/4 of the native people. Deserted Indian fields, ready for tillage, greeted the Plymouth settlers, and scattered skulls and bones provided grim evidence of the impact of the disease. In no position to resist the English incursion, the local Wampanoag Indians at first befriended the settlers. Cultural accommodation was facilitated by Squanto, a Wampanoag who had learned English from a ship's captain who had kidnapped him some years ago. The Wampanoag chieftain, Massasoit, signed a treaty with the Plymouth Pilgrims in 1621 and helped them celebrate the first Thanksgiving after the autumn harvest that same year. As more English settlers arrived and pushed inland into the Connecticut River Valley, confrontations between Indians and whites ruptured these peaceful relations. Hostilities exploded in 1637 between the English settlers and the powerful Pequot tribe. Besieging a Pequot village on Connecticut's Mystic River, English militiamen and their Narragansett Indian allies set fire to the Indian wigwams and shot the fleeing survivors. The slaughter wrote a brutal finish to the Pequot War, virtually annihilated the Pequot tribe, and inaugurated 4 decades of uneasy peace between Puritans and Indians. Lashed by critics in England, the Puritans made some feeble efforts at converting the remaining Indians to Christianity, although Puritan missionary zeal never equaled that of the Catholic Spanish and French. A mere handful of Indians were gathered into Puritan praying towns to make the acquaintance of the English God and to learn the ways of English culture. The Indians' only hope for resisting English encroachment lay in intertribal unity, a pan-Indian alliance against the swiftly spreading English settlements. In 1675, Massasoit's son, Metacom, called King Philip by the English, forged such an alliance and mounted a series of coordinated assaults on English villages throughout New England. Frontier settlements were especially hard hit, and refugees fell back toward the relative safety of Boston. When the war ended in 1676, 52 Puritan towns had been attacked and 12 destroyed entirely. Hundreds of colonists and many more Indians lay dead. Metacom's wife and son were sold into slavery. He himself was captured, beheaded, and drawn and quartered. His head was carried on a pike back to Plymouth, where it was mounted on grisly display for years. King Philip's War slowed the westward march of English settlement in New England for several decades, but the war inflicted a long-lasting defeat on New England's Indians. drastically reduced in numbers, dispirited, and disbanded. They thereafter posed only sporadic threats to New England colonists. Seeds of colonial unity and independence. A path-breaking experiment in union was launched in 1643 when 4 colonies banded together to form the New England Confederation. The English Civil War was then deeply distracting Old England, throwing the colonists upon their own resources. The primary purpose of the Confederation was defense against foes, or potential foes, notably the Indians, the French, and the Dutch. Purely intercolonial problems, such as runaway servants and criminals who had fled from one colony to another, also came within the jurisdiction of the Confederation. Each member colony, regardless of size, wielded 2 votes, an arrangement highly displeasing to the most populous colony, Massachusetts Bay. The Confederation was essentially an exclusive Puritan club. It consisted of the 2 Massachusetts colony, the Bay Colony and the Bantam-sized Plymouth, and the 2 Connecticut colonies, New Haven and the scattered valley settlements. The Puritan leaders backballed Rhode Island as well as the main outposts. These places, it was charged, harbored too many heretical or otherwise undesirable characters. Shockingly, one of the Maine towns had made a tailor its mayor and had even sheltered an excommunicated minister of the gospel. Weak though it was, the Confederation was the first notable milestone on the long and rocky road toward colonial unity. The delegates took tottering but long overdue steps toward acting together on matters of intercolonial importance. Rank and file colonists, for their part, received valuable experience in delegating their votes to properly chosen representatives. Back in England, the king had paid little attention to the American colonies during the early years of their planting. They were allowed, in effect, to become semi-autonomous commonwealths. This era of benign neglect was prolonged when the crown, struggling to retain its power, became enmeshed during the 1640s in civil wars with the parliamentarians. But when Charles II was restored to the English throne in 1660, the Royalists and their Church of England allies were once more firmly in the saddle. Puritan hopes of eventually purifying the Old English Church withered. Worse, Charles II was determined to take an active, aggressive hand in the management of the colonies. His plans ran headlong against the habits that decades of relative independence had bred in the colonists. Deepening colonial defiance was nowhere more glaringly revealed than in Massachusetts. One of the king's agents in Boston was mortified to find that royal orders had no more effect than old issues of the London Gazette. Punishment was soon forthcoming. As a slap at Massachusetts, Charles II gave rival Connecticut in 1662 a sea-to-sea charter grant, which legalized the squatter settlements. The very next year, the outcasts in Rhode Island received a new charter, which gave kingly sanction to the most religiously tolerant government yet devised in America. A final and crushing blow fell on the stiff-necked Bay Colony in 1684, when its precious charter was revoked by the London authorities. Okay, this is page 50, so I think I will just stop here for now. And I think that's all we got through in class, too. So that's pretty cool. Alright, I will finish up tomorrow. Yay!